In this video, we'll be looking at the FACS end-to-end capability. Before we get started, it's important to note that the demonstration you're about to see involves dummy data for 1,000 customers and 1,000 accounts, which has already been pre-processed by FACS in order to do customer identification and classification and to determine what sort of follow-up is required for customers and what sort of data and what sort of records need to be applied to reports. So we're at the main home screen of the FACS application. The home screen is sort of a touch point from which you can go to any other part of the application. The application is sort of broken up into the general user screens, which is made up of the tasks, the search and the reporting FI screens. Then there is several administration screens as well, which includes the dashboard and metrics and so on, reference data management, etc. And of course, finally, there are some technical administration screens as well. And keep in mind that for different users, they can be configured with different levels of access so they can only see what is appropriate to their particular responsibilities. So let's start off with a fairly common example. Let's say that someone in a financial institution needs to look up a customer to understand something about their FATCA or CRS status. The situation could be potentially because the customer's on the phone, they've made an inquiry because they've received a letter or an email from the financial institution saying they need to provide additional information. And it's very helpful in that circumstance for the person who's speaking to the customer to have a single point of reference for all the information they need. So in that case, you'd go to the search screen. Let's say the customer's an individual. You could search on them by their name, for example, or some other piece of information. So in this case, we'll search on the customer's surname. And here we get our search results. There's only one customer that matches that, and we can go and view that customer's record. Now right away you'll see that in the top left-hand side of the screen we've got some quick access to some summary information. We can see the name of the customer, the fact that they're an individual. We can see the FATCA and CRS status as FACS currently has it. We can also see the jurisdictions that is relevant for this customer. And we can see that for US, the customer is considered recalcitrant, whereas for CRS, they're considered to have uncured indicia for Great Britain, but they're not yet recalcitrant, which means that there's still sufficient time remaining for the customer to provide the appropriate documentation in order to cure that classification by either confirming they are a tax resident of Great Britain or confirming that they are not a tax resident of Great Britain. If we scroll down a bit, we can see a number of tabs, and here we have all sorts of different information about the customer. We start off with some basic information, so things like names, birth information, citizenships, and so on. Contact information, of course, so we have access to addresses and phone numbers. Tax information, highly relevant, of course, for FATCA and CRS, so we can see what tax residencies the customer is associated with, what tax identification numbers they've provided, their banking details. So, for example, we can see here that they are the account holder of a single account, and if we want, we can click on the View button next to that account record and actually go in and look at the account record details as well. So here we can see it's a depository account. Once again, we've got information such as, account number, product code, base currency, opening date, account balances and income tallies and so on, contact information, and so on and so forth. So if we go back to our party, we've seen the accounts, we've got relationship manager information. Then also very important for FATCA and CRS is information to do with related parties. So here we can see that this particular customer is a beneficial owner of a company. Okay, and so we have that information at our fingertips. We can also see that there's a view button there, so if we wanted to, we could drill in and see what we know about that particular company as well. In the other data tab, we have information about the financial institution they're associated with, so we can see that they're a retail customer. We can see which financial institution, and then underneath, very important one, is document metadata. So document metadata is so critical because it's a key way in which FACA and CRS status is resolved. In particular, if a customer has indicia such as an address or a phone number in a foreign country, documentation is usually how you cure that or confirm if they are a tax resident. So in this particular case, the customer has filled in a W8BEN form. A W8BEN form is an IRS form which basically confirms that the customer is not a US taxpayer. So we can go in and we can also, if in the data ingestion phase, if the financial institution has provided FACS with a link to an electronic document repository, we can actually go in and view the document in question if we need to. So that's a really convenient way for an operator to go in and check if all the details are correct as demonstrated on the FACS screen. Now the last tab is also very important, of course, compliance information. So we've got several fields that can be added manually, but the important ones are down the bottom here. So we've got the temporal status. Now this determines if a customer is new or pre-existing with respect to FACA and or CRS. And that's important because the rules on how you process a customer differs depending on if they're new and pre-existing. Not only that, but for pre-existing customers, their aggregate account balance must be tested against certain thresholds to determine if they're low value, high value, or for FACA, even below threshold. All of this is done automatically by FACS. And so this table gives a history of all the changes in status. All the rows that are in white are current rows, so that data is current. Anything that's in the light blue with the light blue background indicates historical information. And you can always check that by hovering over the little calendar icon. Okay, and you can see the date range for which the data field or the data record is applicable to. So importantly, you also have to do for pre-existing customers annual retests to see if their aggregate account balance has changed over time. And FACS does this, and we can see that this particular customer for FACA has gone from being a below threshold customer to a high value customer. And because of that, that means that there'll be extra due diligence checks that need to be performed on this customer. We can also see above the temporal status table, the tax status table. And so here we have things like the FACA status and the CRS status of the customer. You'll also notice that we also have information about evaluation triggers. This can be very handy in understanding why a status has changed. There's nothing worse than when you're trying to look at a customer's record, you realize that you looked at it yesterday and today something's different and you're not sure why. FACS will always try to keep you informed of why it makes changes when it makes changes. So we can see that from a FACA perspective, this customer is a possible US person and that they also have unresolved issues present for CRS. Now, these issues we can see in more detail on the Tasks tab. So we have FACA Enhanced Due Diligence Tasks and CRS Enhanced Due Diligence Task. Okay, both of those tasks are currently assigned to someone. And these tasks exist because for high value customers or pre-existing customers, with an aggregate account balance of over $1 million US, there are extra things that need to be done, such as paper-based search, looking for indicia, and also talking to a relationship manager to see if they may or may not have reason to believe that the customer is a foreign taxpayer. Now, because these are sort of internal activities that aren't based on electronic data search, you need to have a mechanism to prove to a regulator, for example, should you get audited, you need to be able to prove that you've actually carried out these tasks. And so that's why we provide the tasks built in within FACS. It performs two actions there. One is it reminds whoever's looking at the task that the task needs to be done to meet the due diligence obligation. And number two, it provides traceability. The task can be assigned to someone, comments can be added when the appropriate actions have been taken, and that way you've got full traceability for when you close the task. But the main task is the due diligence case. And if we click on that, we go and look in at this task. So on the task screen, we can see things like a due date, a priority. If I'm someone who can claim the task, I can do so by clicking the claim button, and all of a sudden I'm the assignee of that task, and there's more actions that are available to me as well. We have the standard sort of things you'd expect, so there's an audit log, there's the ability to add comments, but most of the key information is in the Task Details tab. Initially, we have the party details, which is similar to the summary you saw on the party record. And if you need to view the party record, there's a link available there. Then we have the case update history. As with the previous record, we always like to keep people informed of why things are changing when they're changing. So we have the same sort of information here, where not only do you see the outcome, but you can also see what triggered any change in the case status. And then we have the two key tables. These are the due diligence issues and the indicia that were found. So we can see from a due diligence perspective, this customer is missing a self-certification. So that's one document we know that you need to collect from the customer that the customer is yet to provide. And with regard to indicia, we can see that there are 4 different indicia, 3 for FATCA and 1 for CRS. And notice that all these indicia are on a single screen in a single table. So one of the most powerful features of FACS is the ability to combine FATCA and CRS analysis, and this way you only need to reach out and contact the customer once for both tax regimes, rather than providing a bad customer experience by having to contact the customer potentially separately for both FATCA and CRS. Now, in the final column of the indicia found, all the other columns indicate what the indicia is, what type, the value, and so on. The final column is the status column, and that indicates if the indicia is being cured or not. Now, once indicia are cured, they no longer pose a problem, okay? But the sort of documentation you need to cure an indicia can be quite varied. In particular for FATCA, where different document combinations are needed to cure different types of indicia. Now, what FACS does is it helps you out by allowing you to drill in to understand what those document combinations are. And we do this via the Curing Details button. If we click on that, we go through to the following table. Now, across the top of this table, we can see lots of different document categories. And then if we look down the left-hand side, we can see all the different indicia type and which ones apply to the customer and which ones don't. So all the ones that are sort of grayed out don't apply to the customer, but the ones that are in bold do apply to the customer. Now, for each collection of indicia type, there's often more than one row associated with that collection. Okay, so for example, for place of birth, there's 2 rows next to place of birth. And the reason for that is that there are 2 different document combinations which are acceptable to cure that indicia type. Okay, so for US and non-US phone numbers, there are 4 possible document combinations which are acceptable to cure that indicia type, and so on and so forth. The way an indicia type is cured is if for any single row, if all the crosses can be converted to ticks. And that happens by the customer providing the appropriate type of documentation for that column. So for example, we can see that for US and non-US phone numbers, we have a tick in the column for the W8 form, which means that that is sufficient to cure that indicia. For place of birth, we have a row which has a tick in it, but that row still has crosses in it as well, which means that more documentation is required before we can cure that indicia. And you'll notice at the top that we've got things like, government identification and all these different document categories. You can also hover over these to get some examples of what sort of documents are considered valid for these particular categories. Okay. And down the bottom we have the same sort of thing for CRS. For CRS new account holders, that deals more with reasonable explanations than documentary evidence. So that's a slightly different way of curing those particular indicia. Okay, so few final tables there for the due diligence case. So this is a single screen from which, if a customer has a case and they need to provide extra documentation, in one screen you've got all the information for what you need to ask from the customer, basically. Now, in this particular case, we've arrived at this screen from the customer record. But what will typically happen in a financial institution is they'll have particular staff members whose job is to deal with FACA and CRS due diligence. And what they'll do is they'll come in and they'll go to the tasks screen, okay? And this is like a central point at which they can see all the tasks that are still outstanding and that need to be carried out, excuse me, for FACA and CRS due diligence. So here we have a work queue with all the available tasks that can be carried out by the currently logged in user that have not yet been assigned to someone. And so, of course, if I want to, I can claim this particular task. And what you'll notice now is that the number of tasks in the work queue has just decreased by 1, whereas the number of tasks assigned to me has just increased by 1, because I've just taken on the responsibility for completing that particular task. So that's what assigned to me does. This is the particular tasks that are the responsibility now of the currently logged in user. So each user will have their own tasks. We also have the concept of owned by me. This is important because in many cases, in real world use cases, a person who is responsible for a task may need to delegate that task to someone else to complete a step. And once that step is complete, they need the task back so they can finish it. And so FACS caters for these sort of scenarios by giving you the ability to delegate tasks and having them come back to you. And we've got tables for tasks in which the currently logged in user is involved, and of course their closed tasks as appropriate as well. So we have comprehensive task management, but to go with that task management, we also need to have a supervisor oversight. So we also have comprehensive dashboards, okay? And this is really important to allow supervisors of FACA and CRS teams to understand where they currently stand in terms of task backlog, how many are being worked at the moment, how many are not. And so there's a whole host of different ways of looking at the data via due date, via the actual task type. And in each case, we've got numbers here on how many tasks of each type, what percentage they represent. We can also hover over the chart themselves to see those numbers. And of course, we can drill in if we want and view the actual tasks in question for a particular segment on that dashboard. Now, of course, when it comes to doing administrative stuff like, supervisors trying to understand their workload and that, a key thing that's also required is the ability to filter the data. So we also have a comprehensive filter. You can, make settings based on whatever you want, and then apply that filter and see how the data changes as appropriate. So we've got very powerful filter mechanisms built into the dashboard as well. Okay. So one of the main things, of course, that everyone thinks about when they think about FACA and CRS is producing actual reports. So we're going to take a look at that now. First thing we do is we go to the actual records for the reporting FIs themselves. So there's a number listed here. All the customers and accounts you've been looking at have been associated with the first one. So we'll click on that one. And here we have the basic information for a reporting FI. So we've got all the information to do with things like jurisdiction, whether FACA or CRS is in scope, their FACA filer category, the CRS evaluation approach, and so on and so forth. Any names and addresses and identification numbers that will be relevant to reports that need to be generated can also be managed from this screen. We also have information about submission information. So for example, if reports need to be packaged, we can set that on this screen for a particular reporting FI. So some jurisdictions just want a compressed file. For jurisdictions such as Singapore, they'll want IDES packaging for the host country and US. For any jurisdictions that are non-IGA or Model 2, they'll just want IDES packaging for the US only. Then other countries also sometimes have packaging specific to them. For Australia, there's a bulk data exchange packaging that the ATO uses. And so all these different types of packaging can be configured within the application. And then of course we have the actual compliance report generation. So we've got different reporting periods for both FACA and CRS. The FACA reports go back further in time, of course, because FACA came into effect before CRS did. So let's do an example of generating a FACA report. So we'll do a report for the 2017 calendar year. Okay, and so now we're on the screen for the FACA compliance reports for the 2017 calendar year. And what we can see here is that we've got a nice simple flow chart, and we can see that there's a few different sections here. So report generation is done as a two-step process in FACS. The first step focuses on account assessment to determine which accounts need to be included in the report and which ones don't need to be included. The second step is to then produce the report itself. And the reason we have two steps is because the second step can actually occur multiple times. It's possible, for example, that certain data was left out at the time an initial report was produced. And so an additional report might need to be produced to supplement the original report. It's also possible that the tax authority that received the data can ask for a correction. And so by separating the two steps, we get a clearer picture and understanding of what's going on. So we can see that for this particular reporting FI, we haven't yet run a FACA assessment for 2017. So we'll click the Assess button. and FACS will now go away and process the data. So our assessment summary indicates that a new data report is required. Okay, we've got a number of warnings, but we don't actually have any errors, but we do have a report that's due. Now, one of the powerful things in FACS is that for every account and customer, it will explain clearly what customers are included in the report and why, and also what customers are excluded from the report and why. So we can see also here the excluded account tab. Now this is really important because you need to keep in mind that FACA and CRS are designed to fight tax evasion. So whenever we sit down with tax authorities to talk about what FACS does, this is one of the things they're most interested in, because when it comes to auditing a financial institution, it's not just about understanding who was included in the report. They also need assurance that people who have been left out of the report, that there's a good reason for why that has occurred. And FACS provides that. It's got a clear, plain English reason for why people have been excluded from the report if that's what's taken place. And similarly for those included. So for example, we can see unconfirmed reportable account holders who are recalcitrant, and that's why their jurisdiction is in red. So this is someone who is included in the FACA report because they have yet to provide all the information they require. And then we've got confirmed reportable account holders. So this would be someone who's confirmed that they're a US taxpayer, for example. And the beautiful thing about FACS is it's easy to cross-reference and check all of this information. So for example, that would mean this customer must have submitted a W-9 form, because a W-9 form is the form that the US government has to indicate if someone is a US taxpayer. And sure enough, when we drill into the record, we can see that that's exactly what they've got. They have submitted a W-9 form. So it's very easy to see that all the data marries up, and that FACS's conclusions about who is reportable and who is not actually match up with the data in the system. And as we said before, we can see that there is a report required. To generate that report is just a simple click of a button, select the appropriate report type, and away you go. So FACS is now processing the report, and now we can see we've got an error checkpoint. And this is another really powerful part of FACS. The FACA and CRS compliance reports are very strict in terms of what data must be included. And FACS allows the user to generate reports as often as they need to test whether they have all the current data they need. This is important because in some cases you may need to go back to the actual customer to ask for more data from them in order to produce a valid FACA or CRS compliance report. And of course that takes time. So FACS is designed to get people creating test reports as soon as possible to guarantee that they have enough time to deal with any data quality issues during the report generation process. So here, if we go to the report generation logs, we can see we've got information, warning, and error. Most of the warnings seem to be about customers with no US TINs. It's a warning because it doesn't prevent a report from being valid, but it could just indicate you might have a data collection issue, so they're put in there to make people aware. If we hide the warnings, we can see that we've got an error in that this particular company doesn't have a valid address. Okay, and a valid address within FACA and CRS also means that the country of the address must be clearly identifiable. Now in this particular case, we can go in and look straight at the record for that particular organization, go to their contact information, and sure enough, we can see they have an address record, but FACS has been unable to automatically work out the country. And the reason for that is that while most of us would know that Durham is located in Great Britain, it's not guaranteed that that's the case. And so there's some ambiguity here. What we can do is we can go in and override that if we're very confident that we know the country. So we'll go in, we'll make Great Britain the value, and we'll override it. Now what we can do is we can go back to the previous screen and just have another attempt at generating a report. And this time when we do so, we can see that the report is produced and there's no error. We do have the warnings still, the ones that we had previously, about, for example, that there's no US tin, but there's no errors, which means that the report is ready for submission. We can see all the accounts in the report. Okay, so every combination of account number and account holder, and for certain organizations as well, where controlling persons need to be present, we can also see that information as well. And all of these are links so you can drill into the relevant information. Now this is very important because this is comprehensible. This is information that you can ask a chief risk officer or chief compliance officer to sign off against. And so they can provide their approval via the approve button. Okay, and that way there's full traceability of who's approving what and when they're approving it. So very important. In contrast, the way things are done at a lot of organizations at the moment is that people are being asked to simply validate XML files. And XML files are an absolute nightmare to try and go through and validate. This is the correct FACS report, but trying to get a senior manager or someone to say this is all correct and accurate, it's just not very realistic. So it's another powerful aspect of how FACS adds huge value to an organization. Okay, and then once you submit this report to the regulator, you can indicate that in the workflow, and you can also indicate the status of the submission. It can be accepted with no errors or with record level errors or rejected. Okay, and so that's how we generate compliance reports. So in the admin section, there are a few other things there. You've got the ability to manage data sources. You've got some metrics to produce more executive level reports. You've got reference data management, submission information, user management, and probably the final key one is flexible settings. So these can be very powerful because what the settings allow you to do is that, particularly in a large organization where you might want to treat your wealth customers different from your commercial customers, or you might want to treat your private bank customers different from your retail customers, you've got the flexibility to do those sorts of things. Okay, so for example, we've got a setting here for whether a CRS residence address test is allowed on a party. Now, in a lot of places, this is a convenient way to do things for your pre-existing customers. And so, for example, if we go into this setting, we can see it's got a default value of true. Okay. But one of the considerations for the residence address test is that the residence address must be backed by documentary evidence of that address. That's where things get tricky. So here in FACS, you can put refinement on where this rule is applied. So for example, you might say, look, as a default, I want the value to be false, but I'm going to add a configuration to say that for my retail business unit, I'm going to allow it to be true. Okay, we save that. So now the rule has been customized. Now for retail customers, the residence address test is allowed, but not for any other customers. But FACS is even more powerful in that it allows for more subtle and multi-dimensional configuration. So someone might point out that you have a legacy system for your retail customers where you can't trust that the address has documentary evidence. We can make an exception for this in that case. We can say, all right, for legacy system X, we'll leave the value as false. Okay? Whereas for all other retail business units, retail customers, we'll leave the value as true. And it's simply a matter of ranking these in order of importance. Okay? And once you're happy, you click save and you're done. Okay? So that covers the main functionality of FACS. There is, of course, more to talk about under the reference data and sources and metrics and so on and so forth. But there are separate videos for all these other topics as well, with all the details of those topics.